The current state of the Indian subcontinent is riddled with poverty, corrupt government, and a rise of bigotry between groups that at one point lived in relative peace. We see images of these countries and a rise of racism towards Indians and South Asian people in general, as the internet calls them dirty and subhuman. But at one point, the perception of the Indian subcontinent was very different, and it took hundreds of years of exploitation and violence to change how the world views the people of South Asia. And after the British left, it left the subcontinent an unstable, impoverished place, a far cry from what it was before the British arrived on its shores. From the extraction of trillions of dollars of wealth, famines, population rise, casteism, and colorism, we will discuss how the British changed South Asia forever, leaving them to try to build back their nations to this day. India has a long history of civilization, with the Indus Valley Civilization being one of the most advanced at the time, surviving around 2,000 years, from 3300 BCE to 1300 BCE. It had multiple planned urban cities, advanced agricultural practices, and was comprised of an area about 1 million square kilometers, larger than ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt combined. When it fell, most likely due to changes in climate, the population of the civilization at the time was around 3 to 5 million residents, and these people went on to populate the rest of the subcontinent, mixing with other groups in the region as well as later migrant groups. As these people brought their agricultural practices to these areas, we see that farming became the norm throughout the subcontinent, and with the Vedic age came the start of South Asia as we know it today, and multiple kingdoms followed. Over the next few thousand years, ancient India was a major exporter of luxury goods and natural products like cotton, silk, spices, precious stones, and metals like jewels, ivory, and pearls. They traded with the Roman Empire, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and the kingdoms of the Middle East and ancient China. At one point, it was home to the development of multiple belief systems of dharmic religions, developing from Vedic tradition, developing what we now know as Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. Although there was poverty, mostly during times of famine, it was not a universal state. The periods of the Mauryan and Gupta rule were times of significant wealth, and the economies comprising a large share of the world's wealth. There was also less discrimination, as casteism and colorism didn't develop into its current form until the colonial era. However, of course, it did exist. By the early 1700s, the Indian subcontinent comprised around 27% of the world's entire GDP, which would have been around 150 billion in the year 1700. This region was a global powerhouse. So how did this all go wrong? The first European colonial power to come to India was the Portuguese in the 1500s. It wasn't until the 1600s when the Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British created their own private companies to exploit the East did colonialism start to take shape. The British controlled parts of eastern India under the creative name of the British East India Company, which, by the way, the term East India, which was common through these European companies, actually just referred to the whole region of India as East India. And companies like the Dutch West India Company were in the New World, places like the Caribbean, and that's where the term West Indies comes from. After the British East India Company won the 7 Years' War in 1757, they started taking over more and more land, and by the end of the 1700s, they were the dominant power in the Indian subcontinent. They started to focus more on exporting cotton and tea, as well as taxing the native population, draining the country of its resources and taking jobs away. In the year 1858, they officially transferred the powers to the British Crown, which marked the end of 100 years of company rule and was the start of the British Raj. And over the next 90 years, they continued this path of exploitation. When many people talk about British colonization, you'll often hear them say, well, yeah, it was bad, but it wasn't really for economic gain. If anything, India was expensive to run, or they were actually better off with the British. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Britain drained nearly $45 trillion from India between 1765 and 1938. That's 17 times the UK's entire GDP today. So how did this happen? It was basically one giant scam. After the East India Company took control, they started collecting taxes from Indian peasants and then used the same money to quote-unquote buy Indian goods like rice and textiles. In other words, the people were paying for their own resources to be taken away. These goods were shipped to Britain, consumed there, or re-exported for profit, fueling Britain's rise and even funding the Industrial Revolution. And the theft didn't stop there. Under the British Raj, even when Indian producers sold directly to other countries, the payments were funneled through London. No matter what India produced, the wealth ended up in Britain's hands. This wasn't just colonization, it was systemic robbery on a scale that the world had never seen. When people defend British rule in India, they'll often point to things like railways, courts, or democracy, but the truth is, all of these so-called benefits were just side effects of a system built for one purpose: exploitation. Before colonization, India was an economic powerhouse. In the 1700s, it made up about a quarter of the world's trade. It exported textiles, spices, manufactured goods on the same level as Europe. But under British rule, that wealth was drained away. Industries were deliberately destroyed to eliminate competition with Britain's factories. Policies were written to keep Indian exports uncompetitive, choking off innovation. And by the time the British left, India's share of the global trade has collapsed to just 4%. Let me say that again. Prior to British colonization, India was 1/4 of the entire world's GDP. And when the British came and then left, India was only 4% of the world's trade, 25% to 1/25 of the world's GDP, and the human cost was devastating. From 1769 to 1944, tens of millions of people died in famines, many of them made worse by British policies that exported grain out of starving regions. Many of these famines were man-made or worsened due to lack of action by the British. There were definitely famines before the British. It was common throughout South Asian history because it was an agricultural society. However, the magnitude of these famines were on a different level with the British. During a 50-year period of 1850 to 1900, an estimated 15 to 20 million people died due to famine in India, and many argue that British exploitative practices contributed to 100 million excess deaths during a 40-year period of 1880 to 1920. Famines like the Bengal famine of 1943, where 3 million people died, are notorious for being improperly handled by the British and a result of deliberate British policy during World War II. Meanwhile, divide and rule politics deepened religious and caste divisions, setting the stage for conflicts that still exist today. The caste system did exist prior to the British. However, it is a fact that the British worsened caste relations and made the caste system much more rigid than it was prior. They literally put caste into administrative positions. And in the Indian Army, which still exists today, by the way, their beauty standards of whiteness infiltrated South Asian life, and this is something that we still struggle with today. Watch this video I made about colorism in South Asia. It talks about the origins of both casteism and colorism thousands of years before the British, but how the British impacted it and how it still exists today. Even the railways people praise were never built for Indians. They were built to move raw materials like cotton, coal, and grain out of the country and to bring British manufactured goods back in. The system was designed so Britain could take India's resources, sell them abroad, and pocket the profits. In total, economists estimate that Britain drained $45 trillion from India during its rule. That's not development, that's one of the greatest acts of economic exploitation in history. All these factors left a country completely dry, impoverished beyond belief, and corrupt. To top it all off, as many political leaders wanted separate states due to religion, because of these divide and conquer tactics that the British were known for, British India was divided into two states, India and Pakistan. Pakistan being itself divided into East and West Pakistan later on becoming Bangladesh. These borders based on religion were drawn up by someone that had never even been to India once in his life at the point of partition, and people moved to the side of the border that they were religiously affiliated with. This was a violent time, resulting in the death of over 1 million people. How does a region bounce back from this? The GDP of these countries have all grown significantly since the end of colonialism, but there is still a long way to go. The most densely populated region of India is the Gangetic Plain, and it has also the highest poverty rate throughout Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Jharkhand. Poor infrastructure and administrative failures cannot manage this overcrowding. And sometimes I wonder if the British didn't drain the subcontinent of trillions of dollars, if it didn't cause multiple famines, if it didn't reinforce casteism, if it didn't create a colorist society, if it didn't plunge people into poverty, would things be different? And the truth is, we all know it would be different. People defend colonialism because they don't realize the realities of it, but we see the legacy to this day.